Welcome to the Joyful Nourishment Podcast, a place for conversations around all things food, eating, body image and nourishment. Here we'll explore and unpack all the things that gets in the way of us having a kind, compassionate relationship with food and eating in our bodies, and also how we can find our way back to joyful nourishment in our everyday lives. I'm your host, Lynn Thorstenson, a registered nutrition therapist and body image coach based in the west of Ireland, and I am so glad that you're here. So welcome back to another episode of Joyful Nourishment, and this week I am speaking with Shauna Farrell, and Shauna is a psychologist, a well-being specialist and an intuitive eating counselor. She has a master's in health psychology and experience working with cognitive behavioral therapy. And a lot of the things that we're going to talk about today is the work she does, but also how she became interested in intuitive eating around 4 years ago at this time of recording, when she read the book Just Eat It by Laura Thomas. And she says the intuitive eating principles really resonated with her due to her past history of dieting and disordered eating. And Shauna has an Instagram page with really excellent content, Wellbeing with Shauna. And she started this page in an attempt to connect with people from the intuitive eating community and help people ditch diet culture and improve their body image. So thanks so much, Shauna, for coming on and agreeing to have this conversation with me.
No worries. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So I am always really curious about people who work in the intuitive eating, non-diet, weight inclusive space, to how you arrive there. Because when we are, and I don't know how you, if you think this is true as well, that when we work in this weight inclusive, non-diet space and we're surrounding ourselves with other professionals who are already in this kind of bubble, we forget that it's still a really radical space. It's still so far from the norm of what's out there that, and even when we're bought into it, it's still quite challenging to kind of continues to stay there and to honor ourselves and our values in this space. So I wonder, Shauna, if you could kind of kick off these conversations with, what has your journey looked like to get to here with intuitive eating and weight inclusivity, non-diet?
Yes, very, very good question. So for me, I'm psychology background. So, but even within the psychology sphere, especially health psychology, which I have a master's in, it is very weight centric still. There is a lot of training around weight because they also talk about things like diabetes, which they, within the medical model, would be seen as, weight management would be a way to manage diabetes. So even when I did my training, there was a lot of things around weight. And when I did my training in intuitive eating, I probably would have been in a headspace where I didn't have a very good relationship with food, didn't have a very good relationship with my body, was kind of hardcore in diet culture, and really held those beliefs around weight and health and my body and health and weight and worth. That was a big thing for me. So on my master's, I really bought into all of that kind of weight centric treatment. And that would have been something that I pretty much was a believer of and probably an advocate for. Then the shift for me really was, as I said to you, I read Just Eat It by Laura Thomas. And I just remember being like, whoa, this is hitting me hard. Like, it just resonated with me so much. The idea that diet culture is so problematic, the idea that we don't have to be a certain weight or look a certain way to be healthy. And it was a challenge, right? Because I was doing this master's that was all about our health and the interaction between our physical health and our mental health. But this book is kind of the opposite of what I was learning. So I think, first of all, for me, it was quite personal. The initial introduction to intuitive eating was about me, and it was about how my relationship was with food and my body, and an opportunity for me to really repair that because, and I'm sure I'll get into this as well, I had a very, very dodgy relationship with food. So And it took me a while doing intuitive eating to even realize how bad it probably was. But then when I did that, I felt like it was such an important topic of conversation. And I just felt like so many people could be helped by learning about intuitive eating and body acceptance. And I grew up in a world and surrounded by people who believed the same thing that I did about weight and body image and everything. So for me, it was like, this is such a good opportunity to A, connect with other people so I can get that support, but B, also to help other people realize that there is another way and that you don't have to spend the rest of your life dieting or having a really poor relationship with food in order to be healthy. So that's kind of what brought me to it, obviously more from a psychological perspective. So that's what I try to do now, is tie the kind of psychology side into using intuitive eating and other things, but just to help people to build better relationship basically with food and their body.
Yeah, thank you. And I think what you're talking about is like really common. Like I think, that is a quite common trajectory. And I wonder, I suppose, I'm curious as well, like when those two worlds clashes, like when we have learned, particularly, like even maybe more so professionally, like we've invested financially, energetically, time-wise, learning all of these stuff. And then we kind of bump up around, intuitive eating and non-diet principles and kind of gone, okay, there's a different way. And what am I going to do with all these things that I have learned in this other space? And what was that like for you, like in that sort of professional, personal capacity, in that, when you kind of realized, oh, maybe some of this stuff that I'm learning isn't helpful or
true.
Yeah,
It was definitely difficult because I was not embarrassed for myself, but some of the beliefs I held, I was like, whoa, they were so problematic. Like, fat phobia, weight stigma, I would have had that very ingrained in me. So that was I think for me, intuitive eating was a learning, but it was like an unlearning nearly as well. It was trying to challenge all of those beliefs that I had. So part of it was hard, part of it was great because it was so freeing to realize that actually you could help people in a different way and that you can still think about improving health, but in a way that's not going to be detrimental to certain aspects of your health. And also it's still tough because I know people who work in different fields like doctors or nutritionists or dietitians, and they still have a very medical model or a very weight-centric model of health. And that is how, as you said, 95% probably of people operate. So it can sometimes feel a little bit, I guess, defeating to know that there's still so much of that out there. But at the same time, it feels great to be part of a movement that is working against that, I guess. So it's kind of about both of those things.
Yeah, it's like that both and, right?
Mm.
And I had another question there that I was going to ask. Yeah, it might come back to it might come back to me. And like, so when did you realize then for yourself that, dieting didn't work or wasn't the answer? Like, what does that kind of like personal journey then look like, and realizing that some of these beliefs through your training and stuff was maybe not so helpful? Like, what did the personal part look like then?
Yeah, so for me, it was a long, long journey. I started, I think, Weight Watchers when I was maybe 21. So I actually was maybe older than some people, but for me, that was a catalyst into a massive amount of time spent engaging in diet culture, paying for things in diet culture. And the primary focus was my weight, right? So I did have that belief that it was about my health, but it was really about my appearance and the kind of the worth I tied to that. So I basically went from that to trying every diet under the sun, from like the 5-2 diet, where I was pretty much starving myself for 2 days a week, or like not eating carbs or whatever it was. I was always trying to find a way to lose more weight. And eventually I got to the point when I moved to the UK to study my master's, I had gone vegan. And again, that was all about my weight. It wasn't about, like, obviously I care about the planet and animals, but it wasn't about that. It was literally about my health and my weight. And I'd moved more actually into more of a, like, I'd say orthorexic side, where it was starting to become a bit more like not necessarily eating clean, but like some foods were more acceptable than other foods. And I had a lot of anxiety then around food. So that was happening for me. But at the time I was like, this is great. I'm thin. And like, but I also was like, but I could be thinner. Like I was never kind of happy with what my body looked like. And I also had a pretty bad relationship with exercise. I was using that as a tool primarily for weight loss as well. So that was kind of happening for me. But I guess doing the health psychology master's, it was being reinforced that like, to be a certain weight is good, to be active is good, to eat certain foods is good. So like for me at that time, it was like, well, you know, everything I'm doing is brilliant. And I was actually working on for my thesis a study on childhood obesity, which at the time I remember being like, when I met my supervisor, being like, I'm not thin enough to be here because I'm doing a study on obesity and they're going to think that I, you know, I'm problematic because of my weight. So this was like how bad things were for me in my mind at the time. And I was thin, like I was, it was also kind of dysmorphia as well. I couldn't really see what I looked like. So that was all happening for me, which now I'm like, feel very compassionate towards younger Shauna. But at the time, it just kind of was the mind frame that I was in. I just thought that that was acceptable. I didn't really see an issue with my behaviors or my relationship.
And I think what you're touching on there as well is that, you know, we live in a culture where a lot of these things are acceptable and reinforced by, you know, the medical weight centric model. Like it's really good. And it's like, I feel sometimes it's just like, it's not picked up when things are actually quite problematic.
Yeah.
And it feels really isolating for a lot of people. It's like, you know, there must be something wrong with me because I can't get it together. Yeah. And also the other thing that I wanted to just pick up on that you shared, like that feeling of, well, my body is wrong and what will people think if this is what I look like when I'm in this field as well, which is not something that we talk about a lot in the health professional field about, you know, different sizes bodies and what does that mean for like a person's ability to do their job or usually probably nothing, but but the beliefs and the biases that we hold personally and collectively. So
especially in the health sphere, right? And I think, and we can want to finish answering the question, but even in intuitive eating counseling, like a lot of people look a certain way and there isn't necessarily yet the space for people in bigger bodies because there probably is a lot of fear around judgment as well, right? So it's also being aware that there is, and I think for people, for me, when I was younger, I was in a bigger body, probably not even that much bigger now that I reflect, but big enough for people to kind of comment on my body or comment on what I was eating or comment on my weight. So I think for me then that was very much internalized for me. So even when I lost weight, I'd go to the doctor and they'd be like, okay, your weight's good now, but just like don't gain any more weight. So it would always be that thing that even though my weight was healthy in their eyes, when you're teetering on the edge of what they seem to be unhealthy, or when you're over that, there's a lot more judgment, and then that can become very internalized because you've been told your whole life basically to like lose weight or look differently or to be healthier, this is what you have to do. So it was definitely very internalized for me by that point. But I then read the Just Eat It book, thank God. I don't know how I even came across it. I just remember being like, this seems interesting. And I remember in the first chapter it says like, if you are tempted to go straight to gentle nutrition, this is a sign that you like need to read this book. And in my head, I was thinking, but I just want to know what the rules are. But it really did. It really hit me hard. When I read that book, I was like, okay, I have had major issues around food. I started to realize like how bad my relationship was, like how restrictive it was. But it took me a while. I wasn't like, oh, great, I've read this book and now I'm never going to, be restrictive again. But I think your question was, how did I realize diet wasn't working? And I was at that diet bottom where I physically was like, I cannot do this anymore. Like I got to that point where I was like, I physically do not have the mentality, the capacity, the anythingness to deal with either counting my calories or being hungry or trying to suppress my hunger. I was just like, I'm over this now. So for me, it was that what probably drew me into the intuitive eating, because I knew in my mind I needed to do something different.
Yeah.
And I knew it when I read the book, it helped me to see that dieting wasn't the answer, because it gave me an explanation for all of those things, right? Like, this is why I couldn't stick to this diet. This is why I maybe gained back a certain amount of weight. This is why this happened. And I started to realize that it wasn't me. Because when
Yeah.
you're dieting and you're in diet culture, you blame yourself. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, I don't have willpower, or I can't stick to the diet. But actually, you realize that it's not you. And
Yeah.
that was really powerful for me. And that, I think, helped me then to kind of continue on with my journey.
Yeah. 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 I think that's quite common. I think even for me personally, it's like getting to that place where you just, I can't do it anymore. There's got to be more to it than this. It's just like, it's not possible. And in that space as well, when, you know, when you find yourself there, it's like, oh, I can't do this anymore. You read the book and I'm like, okay, this makes sense. And what was the kind of like, okay, but my body and the size of it, or my weight, like, what happened like in that kind of space there?
Yeah, that was definitely a longer journey for me, because I think initially I was like, okay, I won't diet, but when I do this, my weight will just stay the same. But I had restricted for so long that I did gain weight when I stopped dieting, which I had to then learn that that was okay. And that took me more time to learn that actually it was better for me to be in a bigger body than spend the rest of my life battling against, you know, what my maybe natural size is, or trying to starve myself or constantly be vigilant in what I'm eating to try to lose weight. But it definitely was a harder piece for me, that to gain that weight, right? Because when you've got that damaged relationship with your body, and when your worth is tied to your weight, it is difficult. And I think for some people, they do intuitive eating, they stay the same. Some people lose weight, some people gain weight, but there is that very real bit of coming to terms with the fact that your weight is not your worth, that you can be healthy in different body sizes. But at the same time, we live in a world that views different bodies in different ways. So you have more privilege when you're thin, whether that's clothes, whether that's people not commenting on your body, whether that's whatever, not feeling uncomfortable wearing a swimsuit. So like, you do have to also come to terms with those things when your body changes. And I think it would be like not fair for us to not recognize that that exists, that there is still stigma there.
Absolutely. I think it's really important to name that. And I think you bring up something as well that I feel isn't always talked about, you know, that weight gain is a possibility of, you know, stopping dieting, because sometimes that's what's necessary for the body to heal.
Yeah.
And, you know, what do we do with that? And what were the things that felt like kind of helpful for you, like on that journey? What were the things that resources or ways of resourcing yourself? Because it is difficult, and because we continue to swim in this soup of, you know, thin is better, and, you know, you have to be a certain small size to be healthy, and all, like, you know, it, like, the messaging doesn't go away, but it helps when you put the blinkers on a bit. But what were the things, you know, I suppose what we're really talking about here is like body acceptance. Like, what were the things that has helped you on that journey?
Yeah, so there's been a few for sure. And like, just to say, it's a journey for sure. I still have days where I'm like, oh, I'm not happy in this body, and I have to do work to deal with those thoughts. But I think the things that really helped me initially were like definitely social media, like following people, amazing, gorgeous people just living their lives in bigger bodies. That was super helpful for me to just see like, okay, more than one type of body actually exists, and you can have a happy and fulfilled life in more than one type of body. So that was something that was helpful for me. And then also connecting with people from the intuitive eating community, because as you know, by default, we are people who are also anti-weight stigma and weight inclusive. So I still to this day, even though I talk about it, when I see a post saying like, your weight is not your worth, like that still helps me, even though I like know that now. It's just that like reinforcement. So that was really helpful. I think for me, the other things that I had to do were difficult conversations with people. I don't want to name and shame anyone, but like, you know, we live in a world where a lot of people we know still really believe in weight loss and dieting, and especially women, they have this idea of like attraction lies within your body. And there were people in my life that I needed to have conversations with to be like, this has been damaging to me and harmful to me, and I'm not saying it's your fault, but what I am saying is that I don't want to have these conversations anymore. And I have to put a lot of boundaries in place, which is not the easiest thing to do. But I had to do that for me, because I was like, I can't sit in these spaces and listen to people berate themselves or other people, because that's just going to be damaging for me. And luckily, most people were very receptive to that. Luckily, I have friends and family members who now would be more intuitive eaters and who have left diet culture. I have friends who haven't, and that's totally their prerogative. But I do feel like I've done a good job at shutting down diet talk around me. And even now, when I meet someone new, I'm just quick to do it because I know it's awkward, but I'm like, I'd rather shut it down than for me to have to sit and deal with this. Not always. Sometimes it slips in. Sometimes you can't do anything about it. But definitely the boundaries piece for me has been helpful.
Thank you for bringing that up. I think that's really helpful for people to hear that as well. That is also something that, you know, is necessary to sort of being able to protect oneself, through that healing process. And it's everywhere, right? When you start sort of paying attention to it and what people are talking about, and it's just like, it's just everywhere. So it's really difficult to people have nothing to do with it. It's just like, you know, we see it in and you know, I wanted to kind of talk about that as well, like what you've noticed in your work in the psychology field and health psychology, and like, you know, you talked about your training, but it's not like, even with people like who has nothing to do with anything in the space professionally, this is like a topic of conversation that people talk about all the time.
All the time. I even think yesterday I was trying in a changing room and I could hear a person in there with a member, one of the employees, and she was trying stuff on. And she asked for a size 8, I could hear. And she tried something and she said, oh, it's just my tummy. Like my tummy's so big. And the employee was like, have you tried Spanx? Or like, have you tried this? And it was just like such a normal conversation. They were just chatting about bodies. They were, oh, don't worry, I know how you feel. And it was just like, obviously for me now, because of everything, I feel a different way about that. But like those conversations are so normalized. And like, obviously in that situation, I wasn't going to be like, hey guys, stop talking about diet culture, because like whatever. But it's crazy the amount I notice it now just in general day-to-day life. And I think sometimes, you mentioned earlier, it's still a radical space, and it's hard to be in this space sometimes. Like I question myself sometimes and I'm like, oh my God, is this too hard, or is it too much to try to continue to spread this message, or like to work against these really entrenched, ingrained beliefs that we have? And I do think it's worth it, and that's why I'm still here. But there are days where I'm like, oh my God, I just want to give up and diet because this is easier. It's easier in some ways, but obviously we know it's not easier because it's longer term, way more damaging for us than it is to step outside of that.
And because it doesn't work. And I think as well that, you know, like professionally as well, it's like, it's hard to have those conversations, and it's hard to watch things being done that is harmful. That's just like, it's not that it's not just helpful, it's just actually harmful. And having conversations and people pushing back, you're right, it's really hard. And I think that's when I fantasize sometimes and go, maybe I should just have a different career altogether. Exactly.
More of that. Maybe I should just leave this career behind. But no, I think it is hard, but I think there's a reason we all do it, because we know it's right, and we know that there are people being really, really harmed by the current way that we give care, and like people being stigmatized and people not getting access to resources they need. And like, that is, to me, worth the battle, because I think eventually more and more and more people are going to realize that the way we thought was problematic. But we're just so in that moment now where it's kind of starting, but there's still a lot of backlash, and it can be difficult sometimes.
Yeah, I agree. And I had a conversation with somebody, or I met somebody who has been in the non-diet space. She's retired now, actually, like from maybe the 80s or something. And I said,
wow,
how much, like, do you feel like tired? Like the fact that we haven't made more progress in 30 or 40 years? But she was like, well, we are shifting. And I think that feels like the blessing of social media, that things can sort of spread quicker, and there's conversations and connections that can happen that, otherwise you feel, I personally, I felt when I came upon non-diet and intuitive eating, I felt really lonely. It's like, there is none of my peers that are professional peers that are talking about this. And then you kind of like, oh, I'm not sure I want to put myself out there because it's radical, and like, is that going to be helpful? So what are people going to think? That kind of way.
Yeah.
Once you kind of join your community and you're connecting with other people on that same wavelength, it is worth it. And it's, I don't know, it feels like when you're aligned with your personal values in your work, it just, that makes it easier, I think, even when it's hard.
Yeah, absolutely. And that definitely helps me when it's hard. Like, what are my values? And then also remembering what it was like to not be in this space, right? So like, okay, yes, I'm struggling with my body, but what's the answer to that? The answer doesn't lie within me changing that, because even when my body was different, I still wasn't happy. I still wasn't confident. And that's the same for so many people. And I think it's that for individuals when they're finding it hard, to know that it is hard and it is a process, but like, it's so much more worth it to go through this journey to build a better relationship with your body and with food, and as professionals to be on the right side of that rather than be on the other side. And as you said, I think social media for us is a blessing, because there are actually a lot more people creating stuff around body acceptance, intuitive eating. And even if that's filtering down just a little bit, I think that's, amazing to see.
Yeah, I agree. It's like we're just planting little seeds one by one. And I think about this, that, like my colleague there who's retired now, and I said, well, maybe when you and I retire, maybe we've worked ourselves out of a job. Like maybe there isn't any more disordered eating or eating disorders, or it's very reduced anyway. It's not increasing. I'm like, yeah, I think I'll be good with that. Like,
I'd be good with that too.
We might have made a change.
Yeah.
So, like, professionally then, like having, moved into weight inclusivity and non-diet and intuitive eating, what are the things that you've changed, or is there things that you've noticed that you're doing different now in your professional work to prior to the sort of awakening?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So I think for me, luckily, I kind of learned more about intuitive eating before I actually started my like therapy work and stuff like that. So it was more during my training that I would have had that mentality. And then when I started actually working with people, thankfully, I had already had a little bit of exposure to this. But I think for me, it's an interesting one. I work currently more in like workplace well-being. I do that full time. I am actually going to start to take on some of my own clients soon, which is great. It's just figuring all that out. But I think for me, definitely the things I've learned and that I implement is, if people bring up issues around their body and weight, kind of having good information around exploring why that is, where that's coming from, being able to use principles from body acceptance and intuitive eating, rather than, going to a more weight-centric model, which therapists and psychologists do, which they shouldn't. Like, your therapist should never advise you to change your body anyway, but it happens. It happens more than you think it would, and especially in CBT models of behavior change, it would be setting goals, SMART goals, things like that. So for me, it's just, if something like that comes up, it's understanding where it comes from. And rather than diving into that, goal setting around weight loss, you don't do that. You try to help them to build a better relationship with food. Also, I worked with a good few people when I was working for the NHS with binge eating, and it was so helpful to have the intuitive eating stuff, because our binge eating model of treatment was very structured, because that was the kind of policy we followed. But for me to be able to bring in the intuitive eating, to understand, like, you know, it's the not eating that causes the binge eating. And also for them to be able to see, like, I could give them resources around diet culture and, you know, not dieting and gentle nutrition and stuff like that. So that was great when you're working specifically with the eating stuff, to bring in more of an intuitive eating model, for sure. And also with my colleagues, like, I have done everything I can to educate the people around me. Like, I actually just delivered an intuitive eating training to my company, I don't own it, but that was kind of scary, because I was afraid of the attitudes that might come up, or I was afraid of, I guess not afraid, but I was a little bit nervous about that. Now I'm perfectly able to hold my ground and, like, give my opinion, especially when it comes to this, because I feel very strongly about it. But I obviously wanted to do that in a way that was going to be receptible, and, like, that people could actually learn. And luckily it went really well, and people were actually very interested in it. But even during that training, a couple of the comments made would be teetering on stuff I maybe would have thought or said before I got into intuitive eating. So, but also you need to have time for that, right? Because I was there too. And we know that it's so common to hold those beliefs. So for me, it's obviously just hopefully being a better psychologist, but also hopefully being able to spread a little bit of the message to the people I work with as well, so that we can all just do better.
Yeah, that's so great. Your company is very lucky to have you, I think, and that there is somebody there kind of planting new seeds and different, just showing that there is a different way, I think, can be helpful. And, you know, like when I do training sometimes with professionals, well, like the questions are, but what about health? And what about, but it's unhealthy to be in a bigger body, and all bodies will lose weight if you stop binge eating, and, you know, these kind of things, which is really, like, not true. And the other one is also this kind of, for me, was like, when we are leading with a weight-centric model, we're just inadvertently upholding this underlying oppression or body hierarchies, that some bodies are better than others. And for me, that was like, when I understood that, like, I was like, I don't want to, that's not aligned with my personal and professional values. So that feels wrong. And so I'm like, okay, then it was a very easy call. But you know, it's not always clear cut like that. It's, you know.
Yeah, and I think that can be the hardest bit for people to swallow, because of the messaging we get, because of our medical model, because of even just how we socially talk about bodies and weight, and all of those programs from the 2000s, like, you know, super size versus super skinny, all of those things. I think there is this intrinsic belief that a lot of people have that to be in a bigger body is bad. It's bad for your health. And even if it's not bad for your health, it's not appealing. And I think that is the hardest thing to change people's minds on, and possibly the most important thing to change people's minds on, right? Because that's what feeds into weight stigma, to fat phobia. And for whatever reason, given all of the messaging we've had over the last 50 years, people feel like it's okay to have certain beliefs around people in bigger bodies. And you still see that. You see it all the time within the care system. And we're supposed to be the people taking care of other people, whether that's psychologists, dietitians, doctors, nutritionists, whatever it is, but there's still that very weight-centric model. And I think that drives me as well, because I'm like, I find that so problematic now. At the time, years ago, I didn't find it problematic. I believed it, but it's like, I'm so glad I've unlearned that. And I feel like other people have the ability to unlearn it, but it just is, it's a hard one for people to wrap their head around initially, because of those internalized beliefs that they have.
Absolutely. And I think both for professionals and for everyone, because most of those have become internalized as well. Right.
Totally,
so that's why, like, body acceptance is hard, and as part of an ongoing journey as well. So one kind of questions as we're moving towards the end, but what are some of the biggest benefits that you have seen in your work or personally as a result of embracing intuitive eating and non-diet approaches?
Yeah, I think in my work, it's just being able to spread that message to so many people. And when you see people start to unlearn, or when you see people make that connection of, oh my God, it's actually the dieting that caused this rather than the action than me. Like I have a friend who I kind of, she's a friend, so I wasn't her therapist, but I kind of talked her through some of the intuitive eating stuff. And, she said to me recently she had like chocolate in the house, and before that would have been something she binged, and she couldn't believe that it had been there for like a week or 2 weeks or a month. So it's like, I think those wins with clients or friends or whoever it is, that they can actually start to trust their body and they can learn that they don't need to diet. That's an amazing result of being part of intuitive eating community and being able to teach that to other people. I think for me, the main benefits are like not having to diet, which is so good. Like I don't have to use my head space to think about feckin' dieting or what I can and can't eat, which is great. Not being hungry all the time is also great. Like my arch nemesis is hunger, because I used to be hungry all the time. And just like doing more, just living my life. I'm not saying it's not hard. I definitely still have days where I struggle with my body, and I have days where I, maybe go back into those difficult thoughts that I had. But I think I have just found a way of living that is so in line with my beliefs and my values and will make me happy. And that's crazy to think that that came from intuitive eating, but it also came from everything around that, because you do just connect a lot more to all of the good stuff about you that is not just about how you look, right? So I think for me, that's been huge.
Yeah, that is huge. And it's like, it sounds simple and sometimes it sounds obvious, but it's definitely a journey and a process, and it can take time, especially if we have dieted for like a long time,
many years.
Yeah. So it's okay if it takes, a few months or years, a few years even to sort of ride there.
Exactly.
So final question, Shauna, and I named this podcast Joyful Nourishment, and I'm really curious, of course, what does joyful nourishment mean to you?
Yeah, so I think it's a lovely name for the podcast. And it's like the opposite of dieting, right? Because when you're dieting, your nourishment is the least joyful experience ever, because you're just thinking about calories or macros or micros or whatever you're thinking about. So I think for me now, that is about kind of eating and living in a way that makes me happy and makes my body happy. Being able to be excited about food, not because I'm never going to be able to eat that food again, or it's like a cheat meal, but just because I can have all foods and I can enjoy my life. And I think it's that piece of not having the anxiety that I would have had around food, so I can actually eat in a way that makes me feel good. But I know that encompasses lots of other things as well, right? The way you live your life and your body and your mind and everything. And like, look, I'm still a foodie, but sometimes pizza is joyful and sometimes broccoli is joyful. And that's amazing that I'm at that stage where I can get joy from all different foods depending on what my body needs. So yeah, I think for me, it's just having that happiness around food rather than that sadness or that anxiety that I maybe would have had before.
Yeah, that makes me happy. Just that joyous, that things is like feeding ourselves, that becomes so complicated and so fraught that it actually can turn around and it can be joyful and nourishing. So where can people find you, Shauna? If people want to go and check you out, and I will link to websites, whatever you want to share in the show notes, so people can go and check you out.
Yeah, so my page is Wellbeing with Shauna, so you can find me on there. I do have TikTok, but like more on the Instagram. But if you want to follow me on TikTok, it's the same, Wellbeing with Shauna. And that's where I am for now. As I said, at the moment, I'm working full time, but I am going to start to take on some more individual clients. So if you're interested, you can keep an eye out and see. But I post loads of content because I think as many people as possible deserve to have access to information about, intuitive eating, body image. I also do general stuff about mental health as well. So it's definitely a great account to follow. And I am so grateful for having this conversation with you, Shauna. So thank you for having me so much. Great.
Thank you for listening to Joyful Nourishment. This podcast is produced solely by me with no financial backing, and your support means a lot to keep this project going. If this episode has been helpful in any way, it really helps this podcast to help others if you click like, subscribe, or leave a 5-star review on whatever platform you listen to this podcast on. And of course, you can also subscribe so that you won't miss any future episodes. Find out more about what I do in my private practice and what I offer over on straightforwardnutrition.com. And I am currently taking on new clients, so you will find a link to book in for a free 30-minute session in the show notes if this is something you're interested in. And finally, please come and join the Joyful Nourishment community over on Substack by subscribing to my newsletter.